The senator from New Jersey.
I know I'm going to be shortly joined by my distinguished colleague from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse, in an exchange we look to have, but in order to preserve the time on the floor here, I'm going to start. I come to the floor today to once again join the senator from Rhode Island in calling attention to the crisis that is climate change. And I want to thank my friend Senator Whitehouse for his passion, his persistence, and his refusal to let the United States Senate be silent in the face of one of the gravest threats to ever confront our nation and the world. Some say we can't afford to invest in clean, renewable, American-made energy. Well, I say we cannot afford not to. The fact is, every year that goes by without a comprehensive strategy to reduce the carbon pollution responsible for warming our planet is another year in which the federal government of the United States fails to protect future generations from the immense environmental, economic, and human costs inflicted by climate change. I yearn for the day that this body summons the courage to stand up to the special interests and boldly confront this challenge. For the longer we wait, the more expensive and the less effective we will be. And if you don't believe me, just look at our national flood insurance program, which is already in dire need of comprehensive, forward-thinking reform. I spent the better part of the past 2 years bringing Democrats and Republicans together in support of such a plan. And yet the majority has stubbornly refused to debate our legislation, forcing us to pass short-term reauthorizations that preserve a broken status quo. And like the totality of the climate threat, when it comes to flood insurance, every time we kick the can down the road, the can only gets heavier. For our coastal and inlet communities, climate change isn't some far-out problem. It's here. We're already feeling the effects and bearing the cost in the form of rising sea levels and increasingly powerful storms. And even if the President of the United States suddenly reversed course and put America on a path to slow our changing climate, we would still need to address how we managed a heightened risk for flooding. From fishing to tourism to trade and so much more, the fact is America's coastal communities are vital to our long-term economic competitiveness. And to give up on them in the face of rising sea levels would be to give up on our country. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, sea level rise will put an estimated 325,000 homes and businesses worth more than $135 billion at risk of chronic flooding in the next 30 years. With increased risk for flooding comes a whole host of challenges. Falling property values will further strain local budgets, leading to downgraded government credit ratings. And as communities lose out on approximately $1.5 billion in property taxes per year, hardworking taxpayers will feel the pain. It will cut away at middle-class families' most valuable asset, the foundation of their financial nest egg, which is their home. According to a paper published by the University of Pennsylvania Libraries, and I quote, "As sea level rise manifests along the coast, reducing property value, impacts on revenue will present new challenges in servicing debt and present a greater probability of default by local government. We cannot simply keep spending money to preserve the status quo. We need a system for managing flood risk that pushes our country towards resiliency and treats our people and the communities they live in fairly. But unfortunately, we've remained at an impasse for over a year now, unable to fix a program that we all know is badly broken. We in New Jersey witnessed firsthand the pervasive problems plaguing the National Flood Insurance Program, or what we call it as the NFIP, after Superstorm Sandy hit in 2012. It was bad enough that so many New Jerseyans had to grapple with the heartbreaking loss of their homes in the wrath of Sandy. So it made my blood boil to see the suffering compounded by a badly broken flood insurance program. We found ourselves lost in a system that put the policyholder last, that looked for every reason to deny legitimate claims and made up some when they didn't exist. We had old homeowners who found the foundations of their homes had washed away into the ocean, only to have their claim denied because their insurance company claimed it wasn't floodwaters, but moving soil that caused the damage. The insurance adjuster didn't stop maybe to consider that maybe it was the 5-foot storm surge that moved the soil in the first place. This is Doug Quinn, who served honorably in the United States Marines. It's a constituent who I've gotten to know very well, who got snagged by this very loophole. As you can see from this picture, the storm surge from Sandy inundated his home, and it ripped apart his foundation, leaving a large hole in his living room. But despite paying his flood insurance premiums for years, and despite serving our nation honorably as a United States Marine, Doug's claim was denied. Supposedly, it was earth movement, but the earth never moved until the 5-foot storm surge came along. We saw mitigation programs that were so cumbersome and delayed that so many homeowners simply gave up. We had new flood maps come online that were 80% inaccurate in some counties. We had FEMA using taxpayer dollars to drag homeowners through expensive litigation until they gave up on their flood claims. The struggles of everyday New Jerseyans revealed to me the dramatic shortcomings of our flood insurance program and left me determined to fix them. So I began working on flood insurance reform that took the lessons we learned after Sandy and turned them into action. In the summer of 2017, I introduced the Sustainable, Affordable, Fair, and Efficient, or SAFE NFIP Act, a comprehensive flood insurance reform bill co-sponsored by 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans here in the Senate. And I know this town already has too many anagrams, but this one clearly spells out the 4 major goals we have in this bill. We want the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, to be sustainable. We want it to be affordable, we want it to be fair, and we want it to be efficient. Now let's start with sustainability. We've got to put the NFIP on a path to solvency. Since Katrina in 2005, the NFIP has been in the red, borrowing from the Treasury Department to pay claims. Some say we should just jack up the premiums on homeowners and keep charging them more to get at this imbalance. That if we ask homeowners to pay more and more and more, eventually the NFIP will have enough money to pay all the claims without borrowing. But higher premiums alone are not the answer. Of course we want everybody to pay their fair share, but the undeniable reality is that the more that we raise the premiums, the more homeowners leave the National Flood Insurance Program altogether. And that guarantees the program's failure. So instead of looking simply to raise prices, I want to focus on reducing costs. I believe the best way out of this hole is to make proactive investments in resiliency and mitigation to reduce the damage in the first place. In other words, we must build coastal communities that are resilient and strong so that the damage inflicted by the storms of the future are less expensive to recover. That's why the SAFE NFIP Act includes $1 billion per year in mitigation funding and more than triples the maximum increased cost of compliance, or the ICC grants, from $30,000 to $100,000. We also require that this funding be spent more wisely, allowing homeowners to use ICC grants before their house is destroyed. I've never understood why we require homeowners to sit in harm's way and wait for the next storm to come before we help them reduce their flood risk. It makes no sense. Our bill would fix that. By giving Americans the tools to reduce their risk, we can save the NFIP and the taxpayer billions of dollars. Our legislation also goes after wasteful private insurance company fees, which consume about 30 cents of every premium dollar, despite taking on none of the risk. That's a good business if you can get it. Now, don't let me get it wrong. That's good business if you can get it, and I have no problem with private companies making a profit, but every dollar that they make comes from the pockets of policyholders. The NFIP also currently pays about $400 million in interest every year. That's 10% of its annual premiums, money that could be going towards flood prevention and mitigation. That's why our bill freezes interest payments on the NFIP debt and redirects that funding towards mitigation. Rather than paying interest to ourselves and forcing the NFIP to borrow even more, let's use that money to reduce future damages, save taxpayer dollars, and build safe communities. We cannot have a solvent and sustainable flood insurance program if it isn't affordable to the people who depend on it. The NFIP's debt and major hurricanes have put upward pressure on premiums, making it more and more expensive to get coverage. So it's no surprise that a lot of the people have been forced to drop their flood insurance. Indeed, in the face of rising premiums, the NFIP lost more than 650,000 policies, or over 10% of its total business, just since 2009. Has the risk of flooding decreased since 2009? Absolutely not. Are there fewer homes in floodplains now? No, of course not. When you consider the floods that have struck Louisiana and Texas and New Jersey by way of example in recent years, the answer is an unequivocal no. What's happened is that the premiums have just gotten too expensive for middle-class families to afford. At the end of the day, this also hurts the solvency of the NFIP because just like every other insurance model, a smaller pool means a more risky, more expensive pool. So our bill creates a first-of-its-kind, means-tested affordability program that helps middle-class and working families afford flood insurance. Pricing families out of coverage and leaving them without a way to protect their homes does nothing to address the underlying risk. On the contrary, it will be taxpayers who ultimately assume the risk when they're asked to fund uninsured disaster assistance. It's our responsibility to taxpayers to make the NFIP as fair and as efficient as possible. I have no doubt that hundreds, if not thousands, of New Jerseyans dropped their flood insurance after Sandy because of how they were treated. They faithfully paid their premiums for years, often decades, without filing a single claim. Then when Sandy struck and they tried to collect what they were entitled to, they had to suffer another disaster. This time it was a man-made one, the storm after the storm. After losing everything they worked for their entire lives, they now had to fight against an insurance company and a daunting federal bureaucracy. Some appealed, some sued, and some just gave up. I pledge to them that we never let this happen again. Our legislation makes good on that promise by putting the customer, in this case the policyholder, first. We close notorious loopholes that allow insurers to deny claims, like the infamous earth movement exclusion, when we know floodwaters caused the damage. We fix the appeals process, enforcing FORMA's own deadline to respond to homeowners and giving people who just went through a disaster more time to file their appeal. We require engineer studies to be conducted by, and imagine this, actual licensed engineers in the state that they're operating. We require insurance companies to provide policyholders with all of the documents used to process their claim so homeowners aren't left in the dark. And we end the practice of private insurance companies spending hundreds of millions of policyholder premium dollars on private attorneys whose main goal is to bill as many hours as possible to ultimately deny the policyholder any recourse. Taken together, these reforms will not only give policyholders a fair shake, they will also save the NFIP resources that can be better directed to mitigation, to mapping, and to other cost-saving investments. Now, we've got to recognize that the NFIP and its 5 million policyholders can't solve all of our nation's flooding problems on their own. We need to invest tens of billions of dollars elevating and buying out flood-prone properties that get hit year after year, those particularly repetitive loss properties. We need to incentivize homeowners that ultimately will get out of those flood-prone properties so that they're not subject to the consequences of constantly getting flooded, and we collectively are not subject to the incredible costs that are assumed as a result of that. There simply aren't enough resources in the NFIP to even put a dent in this problem. So instead of spending hundreds of billions of dollars on disaster grants each time a storm strikes, why not spend a fraction of that on the front end that will yield real dividends in the future? When a disaster strikes, our immediate priority should always be to save lives and get survivors back to a sense of normalcy as quickly as possible. But while recovery funding is absolutely vital, it shouldn't be at the expense of rebuilding stronger, more resilient communities, more capable of weathering the next storm. We have a problem in Congress of short-termism, living in the present and not looking ahead. We're afraid of making tough political decisions in the present, even when the future is on the line. We see it with flood insurance, and we see it with climate change. The American people desperately need Congress to overcome this short-sighted short-termism. We must start thinking beyond the storm that just hit, or even the one that is on the horizon. We must begin thinking about the risk over the next several decades, because flood risk is a climate risk we cannot afford to ignore. We must think about what kind of future, what kind of environment, what kind of economy we want to leave to our children and our grandchildren. It should not matter who controls the House, who controls the Senate, or who sits in the White House. The Americans of today of tomorrow, I should say, are depending on us, the leaders of today, to be bold, unafraid, and willing to think big. That's why I hope Republicans and Democrats alike will continue to work with me on the issue of flood insurance and flood prevention when we return in 2019. And I want to thank, as I said at the beginning of my comments, my distinguished colleague from Rhode Island, who has really been the conscience of the Senate on this issue of climate change that affects not only those of us now and here, but future generations of Americans. I've taken one slice of that in talking about the National Flood Insurance Program and how we can mitigate our way and look to a set of circumstances in which we can save enormous consequences to New Jersey families, families across our country, and save the taxpayer money. But the ultimate savior to this question is beyond creating a new flood insurance program. It's making sure that we don't continue to see the climate change that is taking place that creates the storms that my state endured, Superstorm Sandy and other major superstorms across the nation, that put us at risk as a people, that put our economies at risk, that really threaten the very essence of our existence as we know it. And I appreciate the distinguished senator from Rhode Island leading us in this regard. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.